troops before heading to Estonia. Ukraine's foreign ministry has released a video showing a missile hitting the administration building in the second biggest city, Kharkiv, this morning. The foreign minister has described the attack as barbaric and has called for more international sanctions on Russia. Satellite images show a Russian military convoy stretching for 40 miles northwest of the capital, Kyiv. They also show craters at a military airbase and damage to an oil terminal, which was reportedly hit by Russian missiles. The UK's Ministry of Defence says Russia has made little progress in its advance on the capital in the last 24 hours and has instead shifted to night operations after failing to take control of Ukrainian airspace. The International Criminal Court says it's going to open investigation into possible war crimes in Ukraine as rapidly as possible. Amnesty International says cluster bombs hit a nursery last week, and Ukraine's ambassador to the US says Russia has used vacuum bombs. Both are banned under the Geneva Convention. More Western companies are expected to pull out of Russia, with Shell now joining BP, selling its stake in all joint ventures with Gazprom. Walt Disney is also among several major Hollywood entertainment companies to pause film releases in Russia. The group also includes Sony Pictures and Warner Brothers, whose film The Batman was due to be screened in the country on Thursday. You're now up to date here on GB News. We'll do so all day. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. Now let's head to Tom for the briefing.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on both your TV and your radio. Now, in the last hour, the Prime Minister touched down in Warsaw for talk on Ukraine. Let's dive straight into this developing military situation in the region. The Russian army is steadily continuing its advance on Kyiv, with satellite images showing that 40-mile-long armoured convoy on the outskirts of the city. Ukrainian officials have this morning confirmed that at least 70 of their soldiers were killed in a Russian artillery strike on a military base in the north of the country on Sunday. And after Russian forces launched what were believed to be cluster and vacuum bomb attacks, an international criminal court investigation is starting, with prosecutor Karim Khan stating that there is a reasonable basis to believe that both alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity have been committed in Ukraine. Well, let's speak on all of this now with retired British Army officer Colonel Richard Kemp, who can join me now. Welcome to the programme. Let's first talk about the more erratic behaviour of Russian troops in the last day or so. The less discriminatory form of attack, the indiscriminate nature of it. Does this show a Russian army that is flailing?
I don't think it does. I think what it shows is a Russian army that is willing to unleash whatever level of violence it needs to achieve its objectives, and that would include hitting targets that have civilians inside them. We don't know whether they're deliberately targeting civilians or they just happen to be killing civilians where there is a military position. That's something I don't think anyone knows at the moment. But there's a lot of talk about how the Russian army is failing. The way I see it, the Russian army never set out to overwhelm Ukraine immediately. I don't think that was their objective. They probably knew they couldn't do that, so they started off slowly with relatively limited force and carefully targeted force in order to bring Ukraine to negotiations and to get them to come to terms with Russia. That doesn't appear to have worked, and so now, if the Ukrainian army won't surrender in the face of the overwhelming force that's been built up, it will be used against them. I've no doubt whatsoever in the coming days. The Ukrainian army have fought extremely hard, but the Russian army is a massive and overwhelming force.
Is there a worry that we in the West, and potentially us in Britain in particular, have been leaning too much into trying to present the situation as rosier than it actually is, speaking about how the Russian advance is slowing, how Putin wanted to take the whole country in a day or two, and that's not worked. Are we kidding ourselves here?
We are, and I think it's not only the fact that we are trying to will Ukrainians to win, and to be honest, who wouldn't? But we are, to an extent, I think, ignoring the hard reality. And we're also forgetting history. I mean, let's not forget that in 2003, it took a much larger US-led coalition over a month to overwhelm Saddam Hussein. And it took over 6 days in that period to capture the capital city, Baghdad. So, anyone who expected an immediate conquest of Ukraine by Russia was, I think, mistaken. The other issue, of course, is that both sides will be issuing propaganda. And I think, the fact that Ukraine might say that X number of Russian aircraft have been shot down, that might be true, but I don't think we can assume it is. I think we have to take it with a pinch of salt. And that's partly because the situation on any battlefield is always confused, and the reports you get very rarely turn out to be accurate when they're properly assessed.
Now, the Ministry of Defence this morning has said that Russia has failed to gain air superiority over Ukraine. I suppose we can take the specific statements of our own Ministry of Defence as being true. And to that extent, has Ukraine offered a greater level of resistance than perhaps Putin was expecting or hoping for? And that's aside the issue that this is a war that will likely be won by the Russians.
Well, I hope I'm wrong in that assessment that the Russians are going to win, but I fear I might be right. I think in terms of Putin's assessment of the Ukrainian army or armed forces, I doubt he underestimated them. I think that's unlikely. He's got a very effective military intelligence service who have been following and monitoring the Ukrainian forces for a long time. They know that they've been heavily trained, highly trained by Britain, America, other Western allies, and equipped very well. I mean, America could put in $2.5 billion of military aid to Ukraine since 2014. We've also contributed a great deal ourselves. So I don't think they will have been underestimated. I think the reality is Putin never planned this to be a lightning operation. He was always going to take his time. He doesn't want to inflict massive casualties on the Ukrainian people, not because he's a humanitarian, but because he knows he's got to govern that country in some way in the future. And also he doesn't want too many body bags flowing back into Russia to destabilize his regime. So I think for those two reasons, he wasn't trying to, he was trying to, I think, be restrained in his force. It's a ridiculous thing to say, really, because an invasion of other countries is anything but restrained. But in terms of the detailed conduct of the war, I think he was trying to hold back.
And he may not now be able to be restrained, and this is where the real worry comes in, especially in those big cities. I wonder, of course the West has ruled out any form of no-fly zone, any form of direct military intervention. If that makes it inevitable that then Russia will eventually, if not in short order, take the crucial parts of Ukraine, take control over the skies and the land, why is the West committing so much equipment to the Ukrainian army?
Well, I think one reason is that Putin must pay a price. If he wins this conflict, and I think, as I said, it's likely, if he wins this conflict, it must not be easy for him. He must pay a heavy price, which will result in destabilizing his regime to an extent. And the West should be doing everything else they can do, as well as trying to keep the Ukrainian army fighting. The West should do everything else it can do to bring him down. That must be the overwhelming strategic objective of NATO, to see an end to Putin one way or another. And for that, it means that all of our various sanctions, diplomatic measures, isolation that we're doing results in turning Russia into a pariah state for as long as Putin leads it. And of course, at that stage, we could turn and welcome Russia back into the civilized world. But until then, we need to work so hard at bringing him down and preventing further aggression by him in Eastern Europe.
I feel frustratingly impotent that the United Kingdom, an economy much larger than that of Russia, even our armed forces that have not had as much money spent on them in the last decade as could have been the case. Even our armed forces budget is not that out of line with that of Russia. And yet we feel sort of impotent, and the West feels sort of impotent in terms of our response, not able to go further because of this understandable threat and worry of nuclear conflict. This is clearly so frustrating for those in Ukraine. Is there nothing more that can be done militarily without risking that full-scale nuclear conflict?
Well, I think, and it isn't just the threat of nuclear conflict. It's obviously part of it, but it's the threat of a conflict involving two states turning into a conflict that engulfs the whole of Europe, which it would almost certainly do if NATO got involved. I think the time for really serious NATO involvement and a capability to stop this conflict has passed. I think to have deployed NATO forces into Ukraine before Putin invaded would have deterred him from doing that, because he doesn't want to out-and-out war with NATO any more than we want one with him. But of course, there was no political will for that, and certainly there's no political will for any military intervention now by any NATO countries. So it's simply not going to happen. What we can do is what we are doing, I hope we're doing anyway, we say we're doing it, which is to provide the maximum amount of lethal weapons, finance to help the war keep going, intelligence, surveillance, offensive cyber capabilities, all of these things. Everything really we can do short of direct involvement in the war, we should be doing, and we should be doing to as great an extent as we possibly can. And I'm glad to see that at last other European countries, as well as ourselves, have actually stepped up to the fight. Bit late, but it needs to be done.
Absolutely. Well, Colonel Richard Kemp, thank you for helping us talk through that military situation, depressing as it may be. Thank you for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Let's turn now to the politics of the situation. The Prime Minister says the UK will put maximum pressure on President Putin. That was ahead of his trip to Estonia and Poland today. The Prime Minister is now, of course, in Warsaw. Well, let's talk to Bob Seeley, the Conservative MP for the Isle of Wight and former British Army Sergeant, who joins me now. Welcome to the programme. We were just talking through there with Colonel Richard Kemp some of the other things that the UK could be doing to try and address this situation, whether it's cyber warfare or harsher sanctions. As a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, is the UK doing enough as it stands?
I think we're doing quite a lot, to be fair. And I think also that Liz Truss and Ben Wallace are doing a great job, and they're actually leading the way. I think where we could be doing more is not in the supply of military equipment, because I think we're doing a good job and I think we're coordinating things well. And I think the Scandinavian and East European countries especially, and now very belatedly joined by the Germans, are all doing the right thing. The Americans are clearly supplying an awful lot of intelligence and aerial photography, etc. I think where we now have to turn our attention is internally. And it's great that we have an economic crimes bill, which has been delayed from 2018. But actually, that's the tip of the iceberg. And there are a lot of other things that we need to be doing. We need to be changing libel and data protection laws. Effectively, there are just a series of laws that we now need to bring in to stop oligarchs abusing our laws and our society and our standards and values. So that is the next step internally. And we're discussing that in Parliament this afternoon, but also potentially next week as well.
And this is about trying to make the lives of those around Mr. Putin as difficult as humanly possible, potentially trying to change the course of the Russian government through that pressure.
I'm not so sure if it's going to be changing the course of the Russian government. I think we might have missed that chance. And clearly, the one thing that we're getting from all of this is that deterrence has failed, and so that we need to now work out a deterrence that's not going to fail. And I pay a lot of respect to what Richard Kemp has been saying, but I do think one shouldn't rule anything out with the Russians. And when people say the Russians want to live in peace, actually, no, they don't. Well, ordinary Russians do. The millions of Russians who live outside the power elites do. But Putin actually has wanted conflict of different kinds with the West. And actually, he's engineered one of his means of controlling the Russian people is by engineering a conflict, real and imagined, physical or psychological, in terms of information or in terms of cyber and now conventional warfare with the West, to retain power and justify his existence by saying, my state, my Russia is going to oppose the West. So I actually wouldn't sadly rule anything out with him.
And that information war is something that does hit the streets of our country as well. Of course, we saw the Labour Party calling for the broadcaster Russian Today to be banned from broadcasting. Initially, it looked like the Culture Secretary was sort of leaning into that, and now we might be leaning away from it, of course, because the information in Russia is very important as well, and British broadcasters being allowed to broadcast in Russia is clearly quite important as well. Where do you stand on that debate?
I think there are some sensible suggestions that have been made, and I think there are quite a few not sensible suggestions. And I'm afraid I don't agree in banning Russia Today, because as much as it's thoroughly obnoxious and utterly reprehensible, actually, I do think freedom of speech is something that we don't take seriously enough anymore in the West. So I wouldn't do that. Neither would I do ridiculous things like no-fly zones, which are just going to get us into conflict with the Russians. And as we've seen from the surprisingly low levels of competence in the Russian forces, any confrontation with the West is going to be solved very quickly in the West's favour, which means that Putin will escalate very quickly to tactical and then more serious nuclear weapons. So I think there are some ideas that actually, we shouldn't be taking too seriously because they're dangerous and
some of your colleagues have called for a no-fly zone, and indeed I was speaking to a Ukrainian MP on this programme yesterday morning, who also asked for that, as well as an embargo to Russian oil and gas. I think it's clear why people in the desperate situation of Ukraine are asking for this. But what's your message to your colleagues in the House of Commons who have called for a no-fly zone?
Dangerous tactics is no excuse for considered strategy.
Could you expand upon that?
Yeah, look, I mean, Tom, what we've needed ever since Putin declared that he no longer respected the post-Cold War settlement, and he said that back in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, is that we've needed to get in place, or needed to understand Russia's journey to a more extreme position and to defend our own values and standards, and then to try to counter that. And we simply haven't done so because we've enjoyed the money, or some people, a minority of millionaires have enjoyed the money that's come through the City of London. We haven't wanted to upset the post-Cold War status. It just became too difficult to realise what was happening. So even after the Estonian cyber attack, we tut-tutted. After the Georgian war, we tut-tutted. After the first Ukrainian war in 2014, we tut-tutted, slightly more loudly tut-tuts. And then the MH17, the liner, got shot down with hundreds of people being killed, and then Skripal, and we've just kept on effectively with glorified tut-tutting. And now something incredibly serious has happened, and it's clear that our tut-tutting has been no excuse for an effective, or no substitute for an effective deterrent. So what we need to do in the West is very badly to relearn the art of strategy and to relearn the art of deterrence. But pulling suggestions out to feed a news cycle, which are potentially highly dangerous for the future of the world, is not a substitute for strategy. What we need is considered and calm thought. And actually, credit to Liz and credit to Ben, Liz Truss and Ben Wallace, actually they're being pretty considered and very thought through in their actions. And it's actually great to see that level of leadership. But unfortunately, it would have been great to have that level of leadership 15 years ago, clearly with different people who are in the jobs then. And really, we haven't wanted to accept the way that the world was going. And we're now making the same mistake still with China. This is not about being bellicose, but it's about understanding the world as it is, and understanding that best wars are those that are unfought. And the best Ukrainian-Russian war would have been one that the Russians would not have fought because they knew they wouldn't have been able to take Ukraine.
I do wonder what this whole situation would look like were we to have applied the sanctions we're applying now in 2014, when first Crimea was snatched and the Donbass became bogged down. It has echoes of the 1930s, echoes of appeasement. So it's a very concerning situation, but potentially we are now learning those lessons. Maybe too late for some. I'm afraid we've run out of time there in this conversation, but Bob Seeley, thank you for joining us on the briefing this morning. Now, let's turn to Russia. The view in Russia. How safe is Mr. Putin? Does the Russian military agree with his actions? Do the Russian people even? What's the true scale of domestic dissent, and how could it alter the course of this war? Well, let's speak to former senior military intelligence officer Philip Ingram, who can join me now. Welcome to the programme, Philip. We've seen a lot of images in Russia, in Russian cities, of protesters against this war. Now, I'm conscious that we're in sort of positive feedback bubbles on social media in this country. We're likely to share things that conform to our worldview. In your opinion, how real is dissent in Russia?
Well, I think that's a difficult question. The Russian people are not getting the same picture that we're getting. The longer their action into Ukraine goes on, the more that is going to start to change. And that's why we're starting to see the dissent coming out in the streets, because Vladimir Putin is going to have to explain away how the sanctions are impacting and why they're there. And that's not a message that's coming across from Russian TV and other Russian media outlets. And there's only limited access for people out into the wider worldwide media. So they're getting fed what Putin wants them to hear. And that's why we're not seeing mass protests on the street. The other reason is that if people go out and protest, they tend to get arrested very quickly and locked away. If senior decision makers tend to protest, or senior officials tend to protest, historically they've been taking up window cleaning jobs from the 9th floor and the windows have been wide open.
It's a terrible situation there. I wonder, aside from those on the streets, aside from the Russian public who may be feeling it in their wallets with inflation as it is, with interest rates as they are, with the potential slow but real potential for a run on the banks, what about those in the military establishment? What about those around Vladimir Putin? And a figure we've learnt is relatively isolated as things stand.
The military establishment are very loyal to their commanders, and they tend to do what they're told, and they will believe what it is at the higher levels what Vladimir Putin is ordering them to do. The layers are his most senior military commanders and intelligence commanders, but also then in the economic side of things, you've got the oligarchs have probably got more power over Putin's support base than anyone else. You put the two of them together, and if you get a little group of people who properly understand the hurt that's happening to Russia, they might hopefully try and have some form of Kremlin coup. That's the only way, I think, to solve this problem quickly. Otherwise,
and I suppose that's why
time where Russia is going to continue to abuse its position.
And I suppose that's why Western sanctions are focusing on those key power players around Mr. Putin. I'm afraid that's all we have time for in this conversation, but Philip Ingram, thank you for joining us there. And now we need to turn to refugees, because around 500,000 people have fled Ukraine over the last few days. And this is obviously going to be having a huge effect on other countries in Europe. Well, joining me now is Nadia Pilpachuk, an immigration lawyer. Welcome to the programme. There's been confusion over Britain's refugee policy. Could you lay out exactly what who are these 100,000 people who now have the right to come to the United Kingdom?
Good morning. To be honest, me as an immigration lawyer, my only response is I don't know. Nobody knows as yet. Simply because we've had policies, we've had news, we've had talks by Priti Patel, by Boris Johnson, but there is no written policy as yet. So when recently, a few hours ago, I had two family exactly with the same circumstances passing the border between France and the UK. One family had been permitted the entry, another one was denied. And again, exactly the same circumstances. They both have family members here in the UK. Both of the families said they are happy to accommodate their relatives. They don't need any public funds. They don't need any support from the government. They just really need their loved ones to be together with them. One family has been perfectly provided the status for 6 months leave. Another family had been denied and told go to France and claim asylum there. So there is no clear understanding as of now what is going to be happening, because before yesterday, we only had a policy which did allow the family members, the closest family members, meaning the spouses and children of those who have British citizenship, to be allowed to bring their loved ones. Priti Patel did say that she will expand it to another Ukrainian nationals who are here permanently, who got the settled status. But as of now, what about those who are here on the temporary type of the visas, on the work visas, on the student visas, even on the visitor visas, who stuck and cannot come back to, I do apologize, sorry, because I've got my baby here, to Ukraine. So it's absolutely unclear what's going to be happening, how is it going to be handled, and we are all just waiting for the published policy so we can clearly advise people what to do, when to do, and how to do.
And just finally in this conversation, what more could the United Kingdom do? Is this a problem with a specific policy? If something isn't a broad brush policy, like, for example, the EU has done, there'll always be these edge cases, I suppose.
Well, we certainly need a clear understanding of how is it going to be worked, how many people are going to be allowed, how they're going to be allowed, what is the procedure, where do they need to go, whether they go straight to the border or do they apply through visa centers, because at the moment it's just chaos and no one understands how to handle it properly. So obviously we are very much grateful, being Ukrainian, we're very much grateful to what UK is doing and what support they are providing, but obviously there must be a clear understanding and actions on how this can be handled and how people can react, because obviously having someone just flee Ukraine, being under so moral pressure, and then again having another denying not being able to join their families in the UK, to say they are stressful, it's to say nothing. They just fled a true war where people are being shot, where children being killed. So we really need a clear understanding of how is it going to be handled. So they really need to work hard and quicker.
I have to say, I think we're expecting more from the Home Office later this week, but whether it will be clear or not, that's another question. Nadia Pulpachuk, thank you very much for joining us, immigration lawyer there. Of course, that's it for the programme. Coming up, it's To The Point, but first, here's the weather.
Hello, I'm Aidan McGibbon and welcome to a new month. A chilly start out there, but plenty of sunshine as March begins. However, it is damp still in the southeast, having seen a weather front stall through the night and really slow down. And in fact, this weather front links back to a warm front, which is going to push north once again later in the day and through much of Wednesday. So make the most of the sunny start, because the sunshine isn't going to last much longer than the next 24 hours. In fact, for Scotland, Northern Ireland, Northern England, a chilly start with those blue skies. However, apart from a few showers in the far north and west of Scotland, it's a fine day in these areas. And with light winds, it's going to feel pleasant enough, 8 or 9 Celsius. In the south, though, increasingly cloudy and damp. Light outbreaks of rain mostly, but turning more persistent for parts of Cornwall later on, and not feeling so pleasant under that persistent drizzle. Now, the cloud and the rain in the south makes some progress further north this evening and overnight, reaching Northern Ireland, reaching Northern England by the early hours of Wednesday. Always the steadiest and most persistent rain there across Wales and the southwest. Scotland, meanwhile, keeps the clear skies and the light winds, and so temperatures dipping. Another frosty start to the day on Wednesday. But the blue skies this time don't last. That is, a lot of cloud in the south pushes into central and southern Scotland by the afternoon. Increasingly damp for the central belt, for much of southern Scotland, northern